Hey guys, tonight we travel back to the rough, wind-swept plains of ancient Macedonia, around 360 BCE, where the air smells of iron and pine, and the sound of hammers from the royal forges rings across the hills. You're standing in a land that most of Greece once mocked, a place of shepherds and warriors, not philosophers or poets, but that's about to change, because this backwater kingdom is about to rise under one man, Philip II of Macedon. A king with a vision so sharp it could cut through empires. You might want to brace yourself if you lived here. You probably wouldn't survive the century. Welcome to Father versus Son, the hidden conflict of Alexander and Philip II. Before you drift off to sleep, hit that like button, and tell me in the comments where in the world are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there, because this story, trust me, will make you rethink every father-son rivalry in history. Alright, let's go back to the year 35 BCE. When Macedonia was on the edge of collapse. The Illyrians had crushed its armies, the Greeks looked down on it, and the throne was as unstable as the mountains that guarded it. Into that chaos stepped Philip II, a young prince who had just returned from being a hostage in Thebes. Not exactly the resume for a conqueror, but Thebes was where he learned something vital: how to build an army that didn't lose. You see, Philip wasn't just strong, he was strategic. He reorganized his army into the legendary Macedonian phalanx, with long sarissas, pikes, twice the length of any Greek spear. He drilled peasants until they moved like a machine, every man part of a greater whole, and he added cavalry, fast, disciplined, lethal. It was revolutionary. He took the chaos of a wild kingdom and turned it into the sharpest weapon Greece had ever seen. But military genius wasn't enough. Philip also understood people. He bribed where he couldn't conquer, married where he couldn't bribe, and threatened where he couldn't charm. Within a decade, he had subdued Macedonia's neighbors and turned the kingdom into the rising star of the Greek world. Athens, Thebes, Sparta, all the names that once scorned Macedonia were now watching it with unease. Philip wasn't just fighting for power, he was fighting to prove that Macedonia belonged at the center of the Greek world, and deep down, he had a dream bigger than Greece, a dream to unite the Greeks and march east against their ancient enemy, Persia. To the world, it was the greatest plan in generations. To Philip, it was destiny. And then, somewhere between his campaigns, his marriages, and his reforms, a son was born. A boy named Alexander. You can almost imagine the irony. Here was a king who had spent his life carving his name into the world, and suddenly, the next name was already waiting to replace him. From the moment Alexander was born in 306 BCE, the omens were strange. That very night, Philip captured Potidæa, Parmenion won a great victory, and the temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned down. A coincidence that ancient astrologers swore was a sign a destroyer of worlds has been born. Even in prophecy, the boy was already outshining his father. Philip's court buzzed with talk of greatness. The boy's mother, Olympias, a fierce princess from Epirus, claimed her son was not just mortal. Some whispered she believed he was sired by Zeus himself. That one night, lightning had entered her chamber and struck her womb. Whether or not Philip believed that, he knew his wife was dangerous, her ambition nearly as sharp as his own. But in his early years, Alexander was everything a Macedonian father could want. Strong, curious, and fearless, he tamed a wild horse named Bucephalus, when no one else dared approach it, earning applause even from Philip. "My boy," the king is said to have laughed, "you must find a kingdom big enough for yourself. Macedonia is too small for you." It sounded like praise, but it was also prophecy and a warning. Because what kind of son grows up believing his father's world is too small? In those years, Philip's power kept expanding. He conquered Thessaly, dominated Chalcidice, and began binding all Greece into what he called the League of Corinth, a coalition meant to launch his invasion of Persia. But Alexander was growing too, studying under Aristotle, learning philosophy, logic, medicine, and politics. The boy who once rode horses was now thinking about destiny. And while his father's hands built empires, his own mind was building something larger, a vision of a world that didn't just belong to Greece, but to him. By the time Alexander reached his teens, everyone could see it. Two suns rising in the same sky, one old, bright and burning with power, the other young, sharp, and unwilling to live in shadow. And, in a kingdom like Macedonia, that was a dangerous thing. Because every crown, no matter how golden, can only sit on one head. Philip II wasn't a man who shared glory easily. By the time Alexander reached his mid-teens, His father's name was feared across Greece, his victories carved into marble and memory. But behind the triumphs, behind the polished armor and parades, there was tension simmering in the royal palace, a quiet, relentless storm between father and son. Philip had built everything from nothing, a disciplined army, an empire in the making, and a reputation as the man who had tamed the wild Macedonians. He was the builder, the strategist, the statesman, a ruler who believed in control above all else. But Alexander, he was chaos wrapped in brilliance, too proud to follow, too clever to obey, a spark that refused to stay in anyone's fire. From an early age, Philip recognized that his son was special, but he also saw something else, something dangerous. Alexander wasn't content to be the heir. He wanted to be the equal. When other boys played at soldiers, Alexander studied the Iliad, memorizing the exploits of Achilles, the demigod warrior he idolized. He slept with a copy under his pillow, convinced he too was born for legend. Philip encouraged his son's education, hiring Aristotle, the greatest philosopher in Greece, to shape him. In a quiet grove at Mieza, surrounded by olive trees and whispers of wisdom, Alexander and his companions, young nobles like Ptolemy, Hephaestion, and Cassander, learned not only philosophy but the art of leadership. Aristotle taught him about ethics, rhetoric, and the natural sciences, but he also planted something deeper, the idea that Greeks were superior to barbarians, destined to rule others. It was a dangerous seed, one that would later bloom in conquest. Still, the lessons went beyond theory. Aristotle taught Alexander how to reason before ruling, to see the difference between impulse and purpose. Yet, even as the boy learned logic, his heart was already turning toward glory. He wanted the world, not just Macedonia, Philip noticed. And as any father who spent a lifetime fighting for his throne would, he began to worry. The tension wasn't open yet, but it was visible in small things, glances at council meetings, whispers during banquets, a father's pride curdling into competition. When Philip rode at the head of his armies, Alexander led the cavalry. When Philip negotiated peace, Alexander argued he could have won the war. It was admiration mixed with defiance, respect laced with resentment, and their differences went beyond personality. They were philosophical. Philip was practical, grounded, ruthless when necessary. He believed in patience, diplomacy before destruction. He drank heavily, laughed loudly, and treated war as both art and business. Alexander was fire. He saw hesitation as weakness. To him, war wasn't politics, it was poetry. Every victory had to mean something divine, every campaign a step toward immortality. Their relationship was like watching two storms collide, one shaped by discipline, the other by destiny. The rift deepened when Philip began to expand his ambitions beyond Greece. His dream was to unite the Greek city-states under his banner and invade Persia, the richest empire in the world. But for Alexander, the idea of uniting under Philip's banner was unbearable. The thought that his father might conquer Persia, that the great story of Greece's revenge on the east would belong to him, not his son, burned in Alexander's chest like poison. Olympias, Alexander's mother, didn't help. She was fiercely protective, convinced that Philip's court was turning against her and her son. Philip's multiple marriages to other women, especially to younger Macedonian noblewomen, infuriated her. In private she whispered to Alexander that he was destined for greatness beyond his father's comprehension, that Philip's crown was only the beginning of what the gods intended for him, and the boy believed her. At the same time, Alexander's growing popularity among the soldiers and nobles began to unnerve the king. Wherever Alexander went, men followed him, not just because he was royal, but because he was magnetic. He spoke to them as equals, fought beside them, and never asked them to do what he wouldn't. To Macedonian warriors, that was irresistible. Philip began to see something familiar, the same charisma that had once made him king, now glowing in his son. But for a man who had built his own legend from scratch, the idea that another even brighter star was rising beside him was unbearable. Still, for now, they needed each other. Philip needed his son's loyalty to secure the succession. Alexander needed his father's power to one day inherit the empire. But beneath the political necessity, the personal fracture was widening. A small crack, that given time, would split a kingdom. It would take only one spark to make that crack explode. And that spark would come soon, not on the battlefield, but at a banquet, where too much wine and too much pride would turn family rivalry into open war. The year was 33-6 BCE, and Macedonia pulsed with expectation. The invasion of Persia, the greatest military campaign in Greek history, was finally ready. Philip II stood at the height of his power, adored by his soldiers, feared by his enemies, and on the brink of becoming the master of two continents. But in his court, beneath the triumphal cheers and the smell of sacrifice smoke, something darker stirred: betrayal. On a warm spring day in Aegae, the old capital of Macedonia, the kingdom gathered for a double celebration. The wedding of Philip's daughter, Cleopatra, to King Alexander of Epirus, Olympias's brother, and the ceremonial departure of Philip himself, who would soon march east to begin his Persian conquest. The city was alive with music, banners, and gold. Macedonian nobles filled the theatre for the wedding procession, a symbol of unity, power, and the dawn of a new empire. But for Philip, the stage he had built for glory would become his grave. He entered the theatre proudly, wearing a white robe instead of armor, wanting to show the crowd he trusted his people completely. Around him stood generals, diplomats, and bodyguards, though not his son. Alexander had arrived in Aegae, but relations with his father were still uneasy. They had reconciled enough to avoid civil war, but not enough for love. As Philip moved through the crowd, smiling, waving, the trumpets blaring in triumph, one of his own guards, the young officer named Pausanias, stepped forward. Without a word, he drew a short dagger from beneath his cloak and plunged it into the king's chest. Philip staggered, blood blooming across his white robe. He tried to speak, but the air escaped his lungs in a choking gasp. The crowd screamed. Soldiers froze. For a moment, no one believed what they saw. The invincible king collapsing before them, slain not by an army, but by a single man. Pausanias ran. He darted toward his waiting horse outside the theatre, desperate to escape. But fate moved faster. He tripped on a vine, the cruel irony of a grape festival, and fell. 3 of Alexander's companions caught up with him and killed him on the spot. Just like that, the most powerful man in Greece was dead, and his assassin silenced forever. The chaos that followed was immediate. Some whispered that the gods had struck Philip down for his pride. Others said it was vengeance for a personal insult, for a crime hidden behind palace walls. But the most dangerous whisper of all was that this was no coincidence, that someone had planned it. Suspicion spread like wildfire, and 2 names burned brightest: Olympias and Alexander. Pausanias, it was said, had once been wronged, humiliated, and assaulted by another courtier, with Philip refusing to grant him justice. Was it personal revenge? Perhaps. But the timing, the precision felt too perfect. Olympias, who had been exiled and publicly insulted, returned to Macedonia just days after the murder, wearing a serpent bracelet, a symbol of divine vengeance. Rumors claimed she had crowned Pausanias' corpse with garlands before it was burned. Others said she placed Philip's body on display, forcing his new wife Cleopatra Eurydice to watch, then executed her in cold blood. And Alexander, the son who had lived in his father's shadow, who had fought him in words and exile, was now suddenly king. If he was guilty, he never showed it. In public, he mourned his father with the right mixture of grief and dignity. In private, he moved with terrifying speed. Within days, he executed all rival claimants to the throne, including Attalus, the uncle of his father's new bride, and the man whose toast had once called him illegitimate. Olympias handled the rest, purging anyone who might challenge Alexander's rise. By the time the sun set over Aegae, the kingdom was his. And yet, even in victory, Alexander understood what had been lost. Whatever else Philip had been, rival, father, tyrant, he was also the architect of everything Alexander would inherit. The army, the alliances, the dream of Persia, all of it came from Philip. Without him, there would be no stage for Alexander's greatness. In the quiet days that followed, as the fires of morning dimmed and the crown gleamed heavier on his head, Alexander must have wondered, was this destiny or design? The people whispered that the gods had chosen him, but some, more quietly, wondered whether he had chosen the gods. Regardless, there was no turning back. The father's era had ended. The son's had begun. At just 20 years old, Alexander took the throne, and in the blood-stained halls of Aegae, he made a vow that would echo through centuries: He would complete his father's dream and surpass. He would not just invade Persia, he would conquer the world. The morning after Philip's funeral, the palace at Aige was eerily quiet. The torches still burned in the halls, the scent of incense clinging to the air like guilt. Outside, the streets were filled with soldiers, waiting, watching, uncertain. Macedonia had lost its king. Greece had lost its conqueror. And in that fragile vacuum of power stood a young man of 20, his armor polished, his eyes cold, his voice calm. Alexander III of Macedon was now king. For most rulers, a new reign begins with ceremony. For Alexander, it began with blood. He knew that in a kingdom built on loyalty to one man, hesitation meant death. Philip had united Macedonia through fear and respect, but his death threatened to unravel it all. Nobles whispered, generals hesitated, and foreign powers watched, ready to pounce. Athens celebrated too soon, believing the Macedonian Empire would crumble without its architect. They didn't yet understand who had inherited it. Alexander wasted no time. His first act was to secure the army, the backbone of Macedonian power. He called an emergency assembly, stepping forward before thousands of soldiers still grieving their fallen king. The wind carried the smell of iron and horses. His words were simple, but his tone steady, unflinching, reminded them of Philip himself. "You fought for my father," he said, "and you made him great. Now fight for me, and I will make you immortal." The soldiers roared their approval. Loyalty in Macedonia wasn't to the crown, it was to charisma, courage, and confidence, and Alexander had all three. Within days the army swore allegiance. His next move was far less ceremonial. He eliminated his rivals, quietly, efficiently, without mercy. Attalus, the same man who had toasted for a legitimate heir, was executed while stationed with the advance force in Asia. Cleopatra Eurydice, Philip's young widow, met a darker end. Olympia saw to that, forcing her to hang herself, a final, gruesome exclamation mark on years of palace tension. For those watching, the message was clear. The boy king was no pawn. He was the storm his father had prepared, but never controlled. But even storms must prove themselves. Within months of Philip's death, Greece rebelled. Cities that had been beaten into submission, Athens, Thebes, Thessaly, sensed weakness. They saw only a youth on the throne, a son of the man they'd feared, but not the man himself. Diplomats mocked him behind closed doors. Thebes openly declared independence. Even Thrace and Illyria, long subdued, rose in revolt. Alexander's advisors urged patience, negotiation. But the son of Philip had learned a different lesson. Hesitation is an invitation. He marched north before the snow had melted, cutting through rebellious tribes with terrifying speed. The same nobles who doubted him now rode in silence behind him, realizing the young king was even more relentless than his father. When word reached Greece that Alexander was still alive and marching, the shock was immediate. He returned to Thebes with 20,000 men, moving faster than any army had before. The Thebans, thinking he was still in the north, laughed when scouts first reported his arrival. The next morning, the laughter stopped. The Macedonian army surrounded the city. Alexander gave them one chance to surrender. They refused. What followed was brutal and decisive. The Macedonians stormed Thebes' walls, slaughtered the defenders, and leveled the city to the ground. 7,000 were killed, 30,000 enslaved, and the ruins left smoldering as a warning. The message rippled across Greece like thunder. The new king was not Philip's shadow. He was something far more dangerous. Athens sent envoys begging for peace. Sparta stayed silent. The Greek world bowed again. Only then, when Greece was silent and the rebellion crushed, did Alexander turn his gaze east toward the empire his father had dreamed of conquering, Persia. But beneath the armor and the glory, the ghost of Philip still walked beside him. Every soldier he led, every city he captured, every victory he claimed, all of it existed because of the foundation his father had laid, and that haunted him. To the world, Alexander's campaign would look like expansion, but to him, it was inheritance. The completion of an unfinished story. He was not just marching against Darius of Persia, he was marching against Philip's memory, determined to prove that the son could surpass the father. Even in moments of triumph, when his armies shouted his name, Alexander could feel that shadow stretching behind him. The man who had made him, the man he had replaced. It drove him forward with a strange mixture of love and defiance. Every victory was a conversation with the dead. The expedition to Persia wasn't just conquest, it was catharsis. Alexander would make sure that when history remembered Macedonia, it wouldn't remember Philip as the builder, but Alexander as the god who finished the work. And so, as he stood before his troops, staring across the blue waters of the Hellespont, he whispered to himself, "Father, watch me now." The boy who had once argued at a banquet was about to set the world on fire. It began, as so many royal disasters do, with a wedding. By 33-7 BCE, Philip II was at the height of his power. He had crushed Athens and Thebes, forced Sparta into submission, and finally united the fractious Greek city-states under the League of Corinth. His armies were unmatched, his empire secure, and his long-dreamed invasion of Persia was finally within reach. To the outside world he seemed untouchable, a man chosen by fate to carry Greece into a new golden age. But inside the royal palace, at Aegae, the air was heavy with suspicion. Macedonian politics was a viper's nest, and in the middle of it sat the king's family, his ambitious son Alexander and his fiery queen Olympias, both watching Philip's every move. For years their relationship had balanced uneasily between loyalty and resentment. But when Philip decided to take a new wife, everything came crashing down. Her name was Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman, and more importantly, fully Macedonian by blood. To most, that didn't matter, but to Olympias, a foreigner from Epirus, it was an insult that cut deep. Worse still, Cleopatra's uncle was Attalus, one of Philip's most trusted generals. With that marriage, Philip had created a rival faction in his own court, one that could challenge Alexander's right to the throne. Olympias saw the danger immediately. Cleopatra's future children, born of pure Macedonian lineage, could be favored over her own son, whose Epirota blood made him half outsider. To her, this wasn't politics, it was survival, and Alexander understood that perfectly. The wedding itself was supposed to be a symbol of unity, the king, marrying again, binding noble houses together before his grand Persian campaign. But as the wine flowed and the musicians played, pride and jealousy mingled like poison. Macedonian banquets were never known for restraint, and this one was no different. During the feast, Attalus, drunk and arrogant, raised his cup and shouted to the hall, "Let us pray that this marriage gives us a legitimate heir to the throne of Macedonia." The room froze. It was a direct insult, a public declaration that Alexander, sitting just a few seats away, was illegitimate, unfit to rule. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the crackle of torches. Then Alexander leapt to his feet, hurling his cup straight at Attalus's head. Wine splashed across the floor. "You call me a bastard?" he shouted. "Do you think I'll stand by while you make a fool of me in my father's house?" The insult could have ended there, but Philip, equally drunk, stood up too. His face flushed with anger. He grabbed his sword and staggered toward his son. "You ungrateful wretch," he roared. "Do you challenge me, your father and your king?" But in his drunken rage, he tripped and fell flat on the floor. The great conqueror of Greece, sprawled in his own banquet hall. Alexander stared down at him and said coldly, "Here lies the man who would cross from Europe into Asia, and he can't even cross from one table to another." The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the moment the bond between father and son snapped. Olympias fled the palace soon after, returning to her homeland in Epirus. Alexander, fearing for his safety, followed not long after, taking with him his closest friends. The court was now divided, one half loyal to Philip, the other whispering that Alexander was the rightful heir. For months father and son didn't speak. Macedon's royal house was fractured, just as Philip was preparing to lead Greece into a new age. The irony was painful. The man who had united all of Greece couldn't unite his own family. Yet Philip couldn't simply disown Alexander. For all their bitterness, he needed his son. The army adored the young prince, who had fought bravely at Cheronea, leading the cavalry that shattered the sacred band of Thebes. Without Alexander, Philip risked alienating the very soldiers who made him powerful. So, with the careful diplomacy of a man used to balancing enemies, Philip called for reconciliation, and Alexander returned. The reunion was tense but civil. In public they pretended the feud had ended. In private, nothing was forgiven. The court watched the two men like one watches storm clouds gathering. Silent, unpredictable, inevitable. Philip focused on his Persian campaign, assembling allies, securing funding, and sending envoys east. He was closer than ever to his lifelong dream. But dreams have a habit of collapsing just before they're fulfilled. Because in the shadows of Aige, resentment hadn't cooled, it had sharpened. Philip's arrogance had left enemies everywhere. Old rivals, spurned lovers, and even those closest to him, and one of them soon would strike. The father who conquered Greece was about to meet a fate that would shatter both his empire and his son's heart, and set the stage for Alexander to become more than an heir. He would become a legend. The sea shimmered in the morning light. As Alexander's army crossed the Hellespont in the spring of 34 BCE, 1,000 ships cutting through the waves like blades. Standing at the prow of his vessel, the young king looked eastward, toward Asia, toward destiny. Behind him stretched the legacy of his father. Before him, the infinite promise of conquest. When the wind died down, Alexander leapt ashore at Troy, threw his spear into the sand, and declared that he had claimed Asia as a gift from the gods. Then, like a pilgrim honoring the past before rewriting it, he visited the ruins of Ilium, the ancient city of Troy, where Achilles had fought and died. There, before the broken walls and silent stones, Alexander laid a wreath on Achilles' supposed tomb and whispered that he envied the hero his immortal fame. It was not a prayer, it was a challenge. From that moment the son of Philip stopped being a prince avenging his father. He became something else, a man determined to rival myth itself. Yet even as his army marched deeper into Asia Minor, the presence of his father still lingered. The men who led his columns, Parmenion, Antipater, Clytus, Craterus, were all veterans of Philip's campaigns. They had fought under the father, and now served the son, measuring every decision Alexander made against the standard of the old king. And Alexander knew it. Every order he gave was also a message. I am Philip's heir, but I am greater than him. The first test came quickly. At the Battle of the Granicus River, the young king faced a Persian army led by local satraps and Greek mercenaries. His generals urged caution. Wait until dawn, they said. Let the army rest. Cross safely. Philip would have listened. Alexander did not. He ordered the attack immediately. With the river's current surging against his men and the enemy's cavalry lined up on the opposite bank, he rode to the front, a flash of gold armor and reckless confidence. When the Persians saw him, they laughed. Then he charged. The river boiled with chaos. Horses thrashing, arrows slicing the air, shields splintering. Alexander fought like a man possessed, spearing one noble after another until he was surrounded. A Persian prince slashed his helmet, the blade glancing off his skull. Another raised a sword to finish him, but Clytus the Black, one of Philip's old companions, swung his weapon and cut the man down. Alexander survived, blood running into his eyes, and by dusk, the Persians broke and fled. The first battle of his reign ended in total victory. That night, as his men feasted by the river, they sang songs of Philip's old conquests. But when they toasted, it was Alexander's name they shouted. The transformation had begun. Still, the father's ghost would not rest. Every decision Alexander made seemed haunted by comparison. When he reorganized conquered cities, he used Philip's methods. When he offered alliances, he used Philip's diplomacy. Yet for every imitation, he added something of his own. Something bolder, more theatrical, almost divine. Philip had ruled by power. Alexander ruled by presence. He wasn't content to command. He needed to embody greatness. His soldiers worshipped him not just as a king, but as the living echo of Achilles, the chosen of Zeus. The army Philip had built for unity had become Alexander's instrument for transcendence. But there was a quiet irony in it all. The empire Alexander was expanding had been his father's dream. Every city he conquered, every tribute he received, every Persian banner he captured, all of it came from plans drawn by Philip's hand. And the more Alexander achieved, the more he realized that his greatness was rooted in another man's vision. He could outrun his father's shadow only by changing the game entirely. In Asia, he found the opportunity. After the victory at Granicus, he began adopting Persian customs, dressing in their robes, speaking their language, treating conquered nobles as equals. His Macedonian officers grumbled, calling it vanity, but Alexander saw it differently. He was no longer merely his father's successor. He was building a new identity, one that Philip could never have imagined. The conqueror of Greece had dreamed of being master of the world. His son would become the world itself, Greek and barbarian, east and west, mortal and divine. Still, there were moments when the mask slipped. In private, Alexander would write letters home to Olympias, complaining about the older generals who doubted him, about Antipater's stubbornness, about the endless comparisons to Philip. "They say my father did everything," he once snapped at a courtier, "but what was left for me if he left me nothing to do?" It wasn't jealousy, it was desperation. The agony of a son who could only prove himself by surpassing the man who had built his destiny. At night, when the campfires dimmed and the stars stretched endlessly over the Anatolian plains, Alexander would stare into the darkness and whisper lines from Homer, the same ones he'd learned as a boy. Achilles had avenged Patroclus. Now he, Alexander, was avenging Philip. But deep down he must have wondered, was he chasing vengeance or validation? Either way, the road led east toward Issos, Tyre, and eventually Babylon. And with each victory, the memory of Philip faded a little more, replaced by something new. The legend of Alexander, who would not just fulfill his father's dream, but consume it. The father built an empire. The son would turn it into eternity. By the time Alexander reached the coast of Phoenicia in 302 BCE, the world already spoke his name with awe. Cities opened their gates before him. Kings bent the knee. Even the mighty Darius III of Persia, descendant of Cyrus the Great, had fled twice before him. The legend was spreading faster than his army could march. Yet somewhere beneath the triumph, the old conflict still whispered. The voice of Philip, reminding him that the foundation of every glory he now claimed was laid by another man's hands. He rarely said his father's name now. When he did, it was usually in public speeches, carefully framed. "My father prepared the way," he'd tell his soldiers, "but the gods chose me to finish it." It sounded humble, but the men could feel the edge behind the words. The same way Philip had once unified Greece under his command, Alexander was now unifying the known world under his image. Every victory erased a little more of the past, and still, the shadow lingered. When he marched into Egypt, the people greeted him as a liberator from Persian rule. Priests crowned him with double headdresses and hailed him as the son of Amun-Ra, their god of creation. Most conquerors would have treated that as flattery. Alexander accepted it as revelation. In his mind, the transformation was complete. Philip had been a mortal king, but he, Alexander, was divine. The desert made that illusion even stronger. He traveled west across the burning sands to the Siwa oasis, guided by priests and mirages. The journey nearly killed his men, sunburnt lips, water gone stale, sandstorms howling like ghosts. But Alexander pressed on. To him, it wasn't madness, it was pilgrimage. When he finally reached the temple of Amun, deep in the oasis, he entered alone. No one knows what was said inside. Some claim the oracle addressed him as the son of Zeus. Others said the priest merely gave him the blessing of kings. But when Alexander emerged, his face was serene. From that day forward, he spoke of his divine father more often than his mortal one. Still, not everyone shared his conviction. Among his generals, the older Macedonians began to mutter. Philip had built them into a disciplined army of free men, not servants of a god, but now their young king was dressing like an Eastern monarch, demanding proskynesis, the Persian act of bowing to the ground in reverence. To the Persians, it was respect. To Macedonians, it was humiliation. One night at camp, as the wine flowed and tempers flared, Clytus the Black, the very man who had saved Alexander's life at Granicus, began reminiscing about Philip's victories. "We owe everything to your father," he said bluntly. "It was Philip who made us conquerors. You, boy, merely wear his armor." The tent fell silent. Alexander's hand trembled around his cup. He tried to laugh it off, but Clytus pressed harder, mocking the divine airs, the Persian robes, the claim of godhood. The younger officers froze. No one insulted Alexander and lived. But Clytus had earned the right to speak freely, or so he thought. The tension broke when he shouted, "Philip was a better king, and you'll never be half the man he was." In a flash, Alexander lunged for his spear. His friends held him back, dragging him out of the tent. But later that night, drunk and furious, he returned. Clytus was still inside, singing an old Macedonian war song that praised Philip. The moment Alexander entered, the room froze. Before anyone could move, the king hurled his spear straight through Clytus's chest. The man who had once saved his life died on the spot. When the rage faded and the horror set in, Alexander collapsed beside the body, weeping. For 3 days he refused food or drink, calling himself a murderer, cursing the gods for letting anger rule him. "Have I slain my father twice?" he whispered, "once in death, once in memory." It was a moment of unbearable clarity. The farther he rose, the more he became the very thing Philip had been: ambitious, ruthless, unstoppable. He had spent years trying to outshine his father, only to become his mirror. The shadow hadn't been erased, it had been absorbed. After Clytus's death, the army began to fear him as much as they worshipped him. The young king who once fought beside his men now stood apart, wrapped in silks, guarded by ceremony and myth. Yet inside, the same boy who once flung a cup across a banquet table still burned, hungry for approval that would never come. When he next wrote to Olympias, his mother, he ended with a line that said everything. "You were right, mother. To rule the world is easy. To rule myself is not." And perhaps that was the hidden truth of the father-son conflict all along. Philip had conquered Greece. Alexander conquered the world, but neither could conquer themselves. The river between them, pride, love, jealousy, legacy, had never truly dried. It only deepened, flowing beneath every battle, every city, every dream. And as Alexander marched east toward India, where the map itself faded into myth, he carried his father's memory like a wound that refused to heal. By the time Alexander's armies reached the edges of India in 36 BCE, the boy who had once fought for his father's approval was gone. What remained was something greater, and far more terrifying. He was now Alexander the Great, King of Kings, Lord of Asia, and in his own eyes, half divine. Yet behind the titles and the golden armor, a quieter truth haunted him. For all his conquests, he still couldn't escape the ghost of Philip II. He had conquered everything his father had dreamed of, and far more, but there was no satisfaction, only hunger. Each victory felt like a conversation he could never finish. He would stand on mountaintops, gazing over lands that stretched farther than the horizon, and whisper to himself, "Do you see this, father?" The wind, as always, gave no answer. The campaign in India was meant to seal his immortality. It was the farthest edge of the known world, where geography dissolved into legend. His men marched through jungles, so dense the sunlight vanished, and fought enemies who fought from war elephants that shook the earth. The soldiers had followed him across deserts, through mountains and over rivers, but now they began to break. They were tired, homesick, terrified of what lay ahead. Philip's army had once been a brotherhood. Alexander's had become a cult of willpower. When they begged him to turn back, he accused them of cowardice. "My father would never have stopped," he told them. But the words rang hollow, even to him, because the truth was, Philip probably would have stopped. He was a conqueror, yes, but also a realist. Alexander, by contrast, was no longer bound by reason. His war was not against Persia or India, it was against limitation itself. And then came the Battle of the Hydaspes River, one of the most brutal of his career, facing King Porus of India and his army of towering elephants. Alexander led his men across a flooded river under lightning and rain. The battle raged for hours, horses screaming, elephants trampling soldiers, arrows darkening the sky. When it was finally over, thousands lay dead on both sides. Alexander, exhausted and soaked, stood before Porus, who had fought until the very end. "How do you wish to be treated?" Alexander asked. "Like a king," Porus replied. It was an answer Philip would have admired, and for a moment, Alexander saw something of his father in the defeated man's eyes. Pride, strength, and the refusal to bow. He spared Porus and made him an ally. It was one of the few times in his campaign when compassion triumphed over conquest. But after Hydaspes, even Alexander's men had enough. When he announced he would march farther east, toward the mysterious lands beyond the Ganges, they refused. The soldiers who had followed him for a decade now stood in silence, arms crossed. They were done chasing his obsession. For days, Alexander raged, pleading, threatening, weeping, but no amount of glory could move them. That night, alone in his tent, he finally understood the one truth Philip had always known. No king, no matter how great, rules without the will of men. So he turned back. The retreat from India was a slow, punishing march through deserts and heat, so merciless it seemed the gods themselves were testing him. Thousands died along the way. By the time he reached Babylon, Alexander's empire stretched farther than any before it, from the mountains of Macedonia to the sands of Egypt, from the Aegean to the Indus. He had achieved what Philip had only dreamed of, and yet he felt empty. Babylon was supposed to be the new capital of the world, the jewel of his father's legacy, reborn, but instead, it became his final stage. He was 32, undefeated, restless, and sick. Whether from fever, exhaustion, poison, or despair, no one knows. As he lay on his bed, surrounded by his generals, he could barely speak. One by one, they asked him who should inherit his empire. Alexander looked up, eyes clouded, and whispered, "To the strongest." But maybe what he really meant was to the next son who dares to challenge his father. In those final moments, perhaps he saw Philip again. Not as rival or ghost, but as mirror. Both men had been visionaries, both victims of their own ambition. Philip had built the ladder. Alexander had climbed it to the stars, only to find that there was nowhere higher to go. When he finally closed his eyes, the world held its breath. The boy who had once tamed Bucephalus, who had crossed continents chasing his father's shadow, was gone. That the conflict that defined him, the eternal struggle between inheritance and individuality, between creation and destruction, lived on in every story told after. The philosophers would call him a god, the soldiers would call him king, the poets would call him legend, but history, with its quiet honesty, would always remember him as something simpler, a son trying to outgrow his father. When word of Alexander's death reached Macedonia, it spread like thunder rolling across a broken empire. Soldiers wept in disbelief, courtiers whispered in panic, and the old veterans of Philip II, men who had marched behind both father and son, sat in silence, unable to decide which loss felt heavier. The great empire that stretched from Greece to India had been built by two men, one who conceived it and one who carried it out. Now both were gone, and what remained was a kingdom too large for its own heartbeat. In Pella, the city Philip had transformed from a provincial fortress into the capital of Greece's most powerful state. The people mourned differently. The elders remembered Philip's discipline, his reforms, his laughter over wine. The younger generation, raised on stories of Alexander's miracles and victories, worshipped a myth. Macedonia, in mourning, became two nations again, one that still loved the father, and one that could only love the son. And yet, the truth was this: neither man could have existed without the other. Philip had forged the weapon. Alexander had used it. That strange, unspoken partnership stretched far beyond their lifetimes. Even as Alexander's generals carved up his empire, the Diadochi, as history would call them, they ruled with the same cold efficiency that Philip had taught, and the same divine arrogance that Alexander had embodied. It was as though the two halves of father and son had split across the world, one mortal and practical, the other immortal and impossible. But if the world remembered Alexander's conquests, it was Philip's fingerprints that shaped them. Every tactic, every formation, every logistical miracle that carried Macedonian phalanxes across Asia had begun in Philip's mind. Long before Alexander was born, he had taken a poor, fractured kingdom on the northern edge of Greece and turned it into a war machine. Discipline replacing tribal rivalry, unity replacing chaos. When Philip looked east, he saw opportunity. When Alexander looked east, he saw destiny. That difference was everything. And yet, history loves the dreamer more than the builder. In the centuries that followed, poets and scholars would immortalize the son and forget the father. Alexander became the embodiment of ambition, the man who wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. Statues rose in his image. Cities bore his name. Philosophers used him as proof that human will could challenge fate itself. But somewhere, beneath those layers of marble and myth, the faint echo of Philip's voice persisted, reminding anyone who listened that greatness is never born in isolation. You can almost imagine them now in some afterlife reserved for kings and conquerors. Philip, standing with that half-mocking smile, wine cup in hand, watching his son pace restlessly even in death. So, the father might say, "You did it. You took everything I built and made it shine. But tell me, boy, was it worth it?" And Alexander, still young, still unfulfilled, would probably smile back. "You told me Macedonia was too small. I just proved you right." Between them, an eternity of silence. Between them, an empire of ghosts. Back in the living world, the myth only grew. Greek historians painted their story as tragedy, a brilliant mind eclipsed by a brighter one. Roman generals worshipped Alexander but built like Philip. Even centuries later, when Julius Caesar wept at a statue of Alexander, he was really mourning the same thing. Alexander had once felt the crushing weight of comparison, the endless hunger to outdo one's predecessors. The cycle never stopped. Every conqueror became someone else's shadow. And that's the secret that history rarely admits. Every son of greatness inherits not freedom, but burden. Philip's gift to Alexander was not just an army, it was expectation. Alexander's response was not gratitude, but rebellion. And between those two forces, duty and defiance, civilization itself seems to turn. When the dust settled, neither man truly won. Philip's legacy was stolen, and Alexander's empire fractured within years of his death. Yet their story endured longer than their monuments, because it wasn't just about kings and crowns. It was about something far more human, the need to prove oneself to the person who came before, the need to be seen. In the end, both father and son were consumed by that same fire. Philip's ambition drove him to unify a divided Greece, Alexander's drove him to conquer the world. But ambition, like flame, devours its source. Both men burned brightly, too brightly, and left behind ashes that others would fight over for centuries. Still, perhaps that was the price of immortality. When travelers centuries later stood among the ruins of Agag, or the empty palaces of Babylon, they found the silence almost comforting. The stones didn't care which man history loved more. They simply whispered of two lives bound together, one who built the road, and one who walked it farther than anyone else dared. If you listen closely, even now you can almost hear the echo. A father's voice, proud and weary, fading into the wind, and behind it always the younger one, still marching east. Centuries after the fall of Alexander's empire, storytellers across the Mediterranean still spoke their names as if they were gods. In Athens, dramatists compared Philip and Alexander to Zeus and Apollo, father thunder, son fire. In Egypt, priests whispered that Alexander's soul had ascended to the stars, joining the divine constellations he once worshipped. And in Macedonia itself, old veterans sat by their hearths and told grandchildren of two kings, one who had made them soldiers and one who had made them legends. But history, like the sea, erodes memory unevenly. Over time, Philip's name faded beneath the waves, his pragmatism forgotten, his mortal flaws too ordinary for myth. Alexander, though, refused to sink. He became something more than human, more than king. A story retold in every age that needed a symbol of limitless ambition. And yet, beneath that shining legend, the quieter truth endured. Their conflict had not only shaped a family, it had shaped the world. Philip's genius lay in structure. He understood that power wasn't just force, it was order. His armies marched not on passion but on precision. Drilled to move like one living body, his diplomacy was equally sharp. He knew when to threaten, when to flatter, when to drink, and when to strike. He saw politics as a chessboard, and Greece as a game that could finally be won. Alexander's genius was chaos. He turned war into theatre, conquest into philosophy. Where his father sought stability, he sought transcendence. Philip wanted to control history. Alexander wanted to become it. That was the difference between them and the inevitable reason their bond broke. Still, it's impossible not to see how much of the father lived on in the son. Alexander's army was Philip's creation. His confidence, his courage, even his charm, those were all learned at Philip's side. The same voice that once roared across Macedonian battlefields, urging men forward, now echoed through Asia in a younger, sharper tone. But while Philip's ambitions had limits, Alexander's never did. The father had fought to prove Macedonia's worth among Greeks. The son fought to prove his own worth among gods. And perhaps that was the hidden tragedy. Alexander didn't want to surpass Philip's empire. He wanted to surpass mortality itself. To him, conquest wasn't politics. It was a dialogue with eternity. Every city taken, every battle won, was a message written in fire. I was here. I existed. I mattered. In that sense, the feud between father and son was never truly about power. It was about recognition. Philip had wanted Greece to acknowledge Macedonia. Alexander had wanted the universe to acknowledge him. Both succeeded. and both lost everything to their victories. Their story became a mirror for every generation that came after. Roman emperors saw themselves in Alexander's armor. Medieval kings compared their heirs to Philip's restless son. Even philosophers found meaning in their rivalry. Aristotle, who had once taught Alexander under the olive trees of Mieza, later wrote that the greatest tragedy of youth was the belief that perfection could be achieved by force. Some said he was speaking of his former student. And yet, there was tenderness in the story too. When archaeologists centuries later uncovered Philip's tomb at Vergina, its golden larnac still glimmering under dust, they found symbols that told a quieter tale. The Vergina sun, emblem of the Argead dynasty, carved beside imagery of unity, not conquest. It seemed to whisper of the king's original dream, to bring Greeks together, not just through war, but through shared purpose. In contrast, when Alexander's supposed body was displayed in Alexandria, the crowds didn't come to remember unity, they came to worship victory. The father had been buried among his people. The son had been entombed among strangers who called him a god. That perhaps was the final distance between them. Philip's greatness was human, measured, mortal, fragile. Alexander's was mythic, boundless, self-consuming. One built the foundation of empire, the other dissolved it in the pursuit of divinity. Yet both, in their own ways, achieved the same immortality. It's strange, isn't it? Two men locked in rivalry across time. And yet, without one, the other would never have been remembered. Remove Philip, and there is no Alexander. Remove Alexander, and Philip's vision dies in the soil of Macedonia. Together they form the full circle of ambition, the mortal and the myth, the builder and the dreamer, the father and the son. And maybe that's why their story still lingers. Not because of their empires, but because it reflects something universal. Every generation inherits a world built by those before it. Every son, every daughter, eventually stands in the shadow of what was made, and wonders, do I honor it, or do I outgrow it? Philip and Alexander answered in opposite ways, but both answers led to the same end. Triumph and ruin entwined. The kingdom they forged fell apart within years of Alexander's death, divided among his generals. Yet the idea they embodied, that restless urge to reach farther, to build higher, to outdo what came before, has never faded. It's there in every explorer, every inventor, every revolution. The Macedonian echo still hums beneath the modern world. And if you listen closely beneath the noise of centuries, you can almost hear it. Two voices forever arguing, forever entwined. One says, build carefully. The other answers, dream beyond. Together, they remind us that greatness always comes at a price, and that no matter how far we climb, we still carry the footsteps of those who came before. The story of Philip and Alexander didn't end with their deaths. It evolved, spreading like a legend retold by every generation that followed. Historians tried to divide them neatly. Philip the realist, Alexander the dreamer. But history rarely allows such clean lines, their legacies blurred, intertwining like the roots of the same tree. Each drew strength from the other, even in memory. The more one shone, the deeper the other's shadow grew. When Alexander's successors, the Diadochi, carved his empire into fragments, they invoked his name to legitimize their rule. Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Asia, Antigonus in Macedon, each claimed to preserve the king's legacy, but beneath their oaths of loyalty lay ambition Philip would have recognized instantly. The empire he had built as a unified sword, now splintered into rival daggers, all sharpened by the same hunger. Ptolemy, who had once been one of Alexander's closest companions, took the young conqueror's body and entombed it in Alexandria, building a shrine of glass and gold. Pilgrims came from across the world to see it. Roman generals knelt before the corpse, whispering their envy. Centuries later, Julius Caesar, upon seeing Alexander's tomb, is said to have wept, lamenting that by his age, the Macedonian had conquered the world while he had done nothing. The comparison never died, it simply passed from one ambitious man to another, an eternal echo of that father-son tension reborn in new forms. Philip, however, was buried differently. His tomb at Aige, discovered 2 millennia later, was filled with treasures, but it was quiet. No grand marble city, no procession of foreign priests, no armies of worshippers, just silence, gold and ashes. The father's grave was human, the son's divine, yet in their stillness, both spoke of the same truth. Greatness fades, but legacy endures. In Macedonia, The veterans of Philip's army raised toasts in his name long after Alexander's death. They remembered a leader who ate beside them, who bled beside them, who planned every battle not for glory, but for survival. Philip's victories had been steady, methodical, Alexander's blazing and theatrical, but both kinds of victory demanded the same courage. Both men had risked everything to pull a kingdom out of obscurity and into eternity. Even in philosophy their duality lived on. The Stoics admired Philip's discipline, his measured nature, his acceptance of limitation. The Epicureans admired Alexander's passion, his willingness to chase meaning even in futility. Together they embodied the two halves of ambition, control, and chaos. Civilization, it seemed, needed both to advance. And what of Olympias, the queen who bound and divided them? History painted her as a witch, a manipulator, a mother whose ambitions rivaled her son's. Yet without her, the story itself might not exist. She was the spark that ignited Alexander's belief in divine destiny, the whisper that told him he was more than mortal. To Philip, she was trouble incarnate. To Alexander, she was prophecy given flesh. Even in her absence, she haunted their relationship like smoke curling between two flames. When modern archaeologists uncovered her correspondence letters written in careful epirote script, they found words both tender and poisonous. In one, she warned Alexander, "The world will love you only when it fears you. Never forget, my son, even gods are envied." And in that single sentence you could feel the entire tragedy of the Argead dynasty. Love tangled with power, ambition disguised as devotion. In time, scholars began to realize that the conflict between father and son was never purely personal. It was generational. Philip represented the age of structure, the foundation of empire, the discipline of power. Alexander represented the age of expansion, the pursuit of infinity, the collapse of boundaries. Every civilization faces this moment. The builder gives way to the dreamer. One creates walls, the other tears them down. Together, they move history forward. Yet for all their grandeur, both men were still mortal. Philip had limped through his later years, his eye blinded by an arrow, his body scarred by countless wounds. Alexander, for all his glory, died feverish and frail, his voice fading before he could name an heir. Both ended, as all kings do, not with a sword, but with silence. And maybe that's why their story still feels so alive. Because beneath the gold, the marble, and the myth, it isn't really about kings, it's about inheritance. Every one of us, in some small way, lives this story, the struggle to honor the past without being consumed by it. Philip's wisdom tells us to build something that lasts. Alexander's fire tells us to reach for something beyond. The balance between the two is what keeps the world turning. So when you look at their names carved into stone, remember, one represents the earth, firm and measured, the other, the sky, restless and endless. And between them lies everything humanity has ever dreamed, built and destroyed. Because the tale of father and son isn't just about where ambition begins. It's about where it ends. In the centuries after Philip and Alexander vanished into legend, their story became a parable whispered by generals before battle, studied by kings in candlelight, and retold by teachers to students dreaming of glory. No father and son in history had ever burned so brightly or left so deep a mark. Yet, as time softened the edges of their myths, historians began to ask a quieter question: who truly won their unseen war? Some said it was Philip the architect. He had started with nothing, a wild borderland of feuding tribes and mountain chiefs, and turned it into a disciplined machine that conquered the mightiest cities of Greece. His reign brought order to chaos, law to ambition, and structure to dreams. Without Philip, Alexander's legend would never have existed. Every battle plan his son used, every tactic that dazzled the world, had been born in his father's mind. Others said it was Alexander, the artist of war. He had taken his father's masterpiece and transformed it into something immortal. Philip had conquered nations. Alexander conquered imagination. Philip had unified Greece. Alexander had unified myth and memory. His victory stretched so far, his charisma burned so fiercely, that 2,000 years later, schoolchildren would still trace his campaigns across maps and wonder how one man could move armies like brushstrokes. But the truth is, neither won. The victory belonged to time. For time, more than any enemy, knows how to break even the strongest legacies. The Macedonian Empire fractured the moment Alexander's body grew cold. His generals, who had once toasted his name, divided his kingdom like scavengers around a fallen lion. They fought not for ideals, but for inheritance, each claiming to be his rightful heir. Within a generation, the empire that had reached the edges of India had splintered into a dozen competing dynasties, and Macedonia itself, the land both father and son had died for, fell into chaos. The irony would not have been lost on Philip. He had spent his life turning chaos into order. Alexander's conquests turned order back into chaos again. It was as if the balance between them had to be restored. The builder and the destroyer, forever balancing the scales of history. Still, the echo of their ambition didn't die with them. It lingered like smoke over every empire that followed. The Romans built their legions on Philip's discipline, and their ambition on Alexander's example. Julius Caesar studied their wars, Augustus studied their politics, and later emperors carried portraits of Alexander on their journeys as talismans of destiny. Even in failure, the Macedonian blueprint endured. But beyond the politics and the warfare, their story had a more human legacy, a lesson about fathers and sons, and the unbearable weight of inheritance. Think of Philip, a man who had clawed his way to the top, only to watch his own son rise higher still. Imagine the pride mixed with pain when he saw Alexander's brilliance outshine his own, the knowledge that everything he'd built would one day be claimed by another name. Perhaps that's why he drank so much, why his laughter grew sharper, why every celebration carried an undercurrent of threat. Greatness is a crown that cuts both ways. And think of Alexander, a young man raised in the shadow of a titan. Every victory he won, as a boy, was measured against his father's approval, every mistake magnified. How do you love a man who teaches you strength, but never lets you feel it? How do you inherit a throne, without feeling like you stole it? For Alexander, the answer was conquest. He didn't just want to be Philip's heir, he wanted to be his replacement in the memory of the world. That's why their story still feels alive. Not as history, but as reflection. Every generation carries a version of that same conflict. The struggle between what was built and what must come next. Philip represents the legacy we inherit. Alexander represents the future we chase. Between them lies the fragile bridge every child must cross. The moment when admiration becomes competition, when love becomes rivalry, when legacy becomes burden. Even at the height of his empire surrounded by banners and worship, Alexander never escaped that bridge. The farther he marched, the more he seemed to be running, not from enemies but from his father's ghost. His empire stretched across continents, yet he remained a son searching for approval that would never come. And maybe that's why, even as he lay dying in Babylon, he didn't call for priests or generals, but whispered to his companions, "Remember me." The plea wasn't for his soldiers, it was for his father. Philip, of course, was long gone. But if the old king could have heard those words echo through time, perhaps he would have smiled. Perhaps he would have raised his cup, that same one he once lifted at a wedding, and said, "I do, boy, I remember you." And with that, maybe their war, centuries long, invisible, eternal, would finally have ended. As centuries rolled into millennia, the names Philip and Alexander became less like people and more like symbols. In every age, they reappeared under new faces, a father who builds and a son who burns, a ruler who unites and a dreamer who conquers. Kingdoms fell, languages changed, empires rose and vanished, but their shadows stretched quietly across it all. Even today, somewhere deep inside the modern pulse of ambition, their argument still hums. The tension between structure and expansion, discipline and daring, the builder and the breaker. It's strange to imagine that once, they were just flesh and bone. Philip, limping through his palace halls, the old scars of war marking his body like a roadmap of ambition. Alexander, restless and radiant, pacing under the same roof, dreaming of oceans and stars. Their story has grown so colossal that we forget how small their world really was. A few dusty kingdoms, a handful of city-states, a fragile alliance of men held together by pride and fear. And yet somehow that small world birthed an idea that would reshape humanity's sense of itself. When Alexander's conquests dissolved into the Hellenistic kingdoms, Greek culture spread farther than any philosopher of Athens had ever dreamed. Cities bearing his name, Alexandria, Alexandropolis, Alexandrette, sprang up from Egypt to Bactria, each one a spark of the same vision. The world grew wider, more connected. Libraries flourished, trade routes stretched, and languages mingled. In this way, Alexander achieved what Philip could not. He broke the boundaries between civilizations. The East and West began to blend, not in peace, but in influence. But look closely, and you'll see Philip's fingerprints in every stone of that transformation. His armies had made it possible. His reforms had trained the men who marched those impossible miles. His politics had created the alliances that kept the empire alive long enough for Alexander to take it global. The father had built the bones, the son had given them motion. Even in philosophy, their duality survived. Stoics quoted Philip's self-control, teaching that discipline is the foundation of freedom. Epicureans admired Alexander's courage to chase desire, arguing that without passion, life has no meaning. Centuries later, Renaissance thinkers revived both sides, the architect and the artist, the order and the chaos, as the twin forces that drive every human achievement. And that's perhaps why their story feels eternal. Because whether we're kings or not, we all stand somewhere between them. We inherit what others built, and we long to build something new. We are all, in some way, both Philip and Alexander. In the modern world, the ruins of their empire still whisper their names. The tomb at Vergina, believed to hold Philip's bones, lies beneath layers of gold and marble, the sunburst emblem of the Argead dynasty shining proudly on its casket. Nearby, archaeologists found the bones of a woman, perhaps Cleopatra Eurydice, perhaps another lost queen, silent reminders of the cost of ambition. Every artifact gleams like a memory struggling not to fade. Far to the south, in Alexandria, Egypt, the city that bears the sun's name, the great library is gone, the tomb long lost, the sea swallowing what time forgot. Yet, something of him remains, not in marble, but in the restlessness of the city itself, the way it looks both east and west at once, the way its people move between languages and faiths, chasing trade and knowledge across continents. That's Alexander's inheritance. A world no longer bounded by borders, a world still hungry for more. It's poetic, isn't it? The father built a kingdom, the son built a world, and in doing so they built us. But if you could bring them together again, father and son, centuries beyond their wars and pride, you might find them laughing at it all. Philip, glass in hand, would probably say, "You always had to have the last word, didn't you?" And Alexander, with that same half-smile, would answer, "Someone had to finish your sentence." They'd argue, of course. They always would. But maybe, at last, it wouldn't be anger, just recognition. Because, in the end, they weren't opposites. They were halves of the same design. One dreaming forward, the other holding the dream together. And maybe that's what greatness really is. Not perfection, not peace, but the eternal dialogue between what was and what could be. Their story reminds us that ambition isn't evil. It's inheritance. The fire we carry from those who came before us, reshaped, reignited, never extinguished. Philip's torch became Alexander's blaze, and that flame still burns quietly in us, in every child who looks at their parents' world and thinks, "I can make it bigger." And maybe that's the truest legacy of all. The winds of history rarely preserve men as they were. They turn them into mirrors for the ages that follow. And so Philip and Alexander became more than father and son. They became symbols of two eternal hungers, the hunger to build and the hunger to transcend. The first creates civilization, the second risks destroying it. Yet both are necessary. Without Philip's order, the world crumbles. Without Alexander's fire, it never moves forward. You can almost trace that balance through every empire that came after them. The Romans built like Philip, patient, methodical, obsessed with roads, law, and discipline. But they dreamed like Alexander, endless expansion, the promise of eternal glory, the belief that civilization could spread across oceans. When the Caesars rose, they carried both legacies in their blood. Philip's structure in their senate, Alexander's arrogance in their ambition. Even later, in the Middle Ages, when kings ruled from castles and faith replaced reason, echoes of Macedonia still lingered. Every crusade, every conquest dressed in divine language, carried a hint of Alexander's hunger for destiny. Every careful alliance, every bureaucratic empire hidden behind parchment and seal, bore Philip's fingerprints. But for all the grandeur that followed, there was one thing neither man could conquer: Time's slow erasure. For centuries, the Macedonian kingdom vanished beneath layers of dust and myth. Alexander lived on in stories, the Alexander romance, a wild mixture of history and fantasy that transformed him into a hero who battled monsters, descended into the sea, and flew into the sky. He became every culture's adopted son, to the Persians, a noble warrior, to the Arabs, a seeker of truth, to the Europeans, the perfect conqueror. Philip, meanwhile, receded into the footnotes, the man before the legend, the builder whose bricks were mistaken for nature itself. And yet, in a quiet way, Philip's survival was deeper. His name became less visible, but his influence more invisible, woven into the very structure of nations. He had invented a system that outlived him. Organized armies, centralized power, diplomacy mixed with threat. His was the legacy of how to rule, not just why. Alexander's, on the other hand, was the legacy of why to dream. It's easy to admire the son and forget the father. We do it in our own lives too. The world celebrates visionaries, the ones who push beyond limits, but it rarely applauds those who lay the groundwork that makes those leaps possible. Philip was the scaffolding beneath Alexander's monument, and scaffolding never gets remembered, but remove it, and the whole structure collapses. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine their final meeting, not in the heat of Age's torches, not at the edge of a spear, but somewhere beyond time, a place where pride no longer matters. Philip, broad-shouldered and scarred, leans on his cane, his good eye gleaming with mischief. "So," he says, "you finally found peace, boy." Alexander smiles faintly, still restless, still young. "I found everything else first." "Was it worth it?" Philip asks. Alexander looks away, east perhaps, toward that endless horizon he never stopped chasing. "Ask me again when the world forgets your name." Philip chuckles, the sound low and proud. "They'll forget yours too." Alexander grins. "Then maybe we did something right. Because that's the secret of all great stories. They end. But they never really end. They linger in the quiet spaces between memory and meaning. Today, when archaeologists brush sand off Macedonian gold, or when students read Aristotle's lessons to his young prince, that dialogue still hums in the background. Father and son, builder and dreamer. Never reconciled, never apart. Their story belongs not to the past, but to the present, to every person who has ever tried to both honor and outgrow where they came from. It's there, in the entrepreneur who breaks his mentor's mold, in the artist who surpasses her teacher, in the child who both loves and rebels against the world that raised them. Every time someone says, "I'll go farther," the spirit of Alexander speaks. Every time someone answers, "Build something solid first," the wisdom of Philip replies. And so, the conversation continues across centuries, across generations, across the quiet spaces between ambition and gratitude. It's an unfinished dialogue, the kind that keeps humanity in motion. Perhaps that's the most enduring empire either of them ever built. Not one of land or marble, but of mindset, the eternal tension between pride and progress. And though the dust of their bones lies cold, that tension still burns in us all, a whisper urging us forward, a memory reminding us where we began. It's easy to think of Philip and Alexander as distant statues, trapped in museums and textbooks. But their story is closer to us than it seems. Every generation, in every home, relives a smaller version of their struggle. The moment when one hand builds and another hand reaches beyond it. The moment when love becomes rivalry, when pride becomes fuel, when the teacher realizes the student has stopped listening because the student has learned to dream louder. That's the heart of their tragedy. Not hatred, but misunderstanding. Philip never truly feared his son's ambition. He feared being erased by it. And Alexander never truly hated his father. He hated the idea of being forever compared to him. Both men were mirrors, each reflecting the other's brilliance until neither could tell where one ended and the other began. You can almost imagine how it felt for Philip in those last years. He had spent his life fighting uphill battles, turning a forgotten kingdom into the heart of Greece. And now, just as everything was within reach, his own son, his own creation began to outshine him. Every council meeting must have felt like watching the torch being passed, not with ceremony, but with rebellion. The boy he had raised to carry his legacy was no longer a soldier in his army. He was a rival in his story. For Alexander, the feeling was different. The growing realization that every step forward came with an echo behind it. "You're your father's son," the courtiers would say, meaning it as praise. But to Alexander it was a curse. He didn't want to be the next Philip, he wanted to be the first Alexander. And so, he built his life as a monument to difference, not to extend his father's shadow, but to escape it. That's the strange cruelty of inheritance. You spend your early years longing to be like your parents, and the rest of your life trying not to be. And yet, for all their rivalry, there was love. Fierce, silent, unspoken love that neither man could express while the other lived. Philip's gruff praise, Alexander's rare moments of humility, those were the fragments of affection buried under years of pride. When Philip once told his son, "You must find a kingdom big enough for yourself. Macedonia is too small," he meant it half as a challenge and half as a blessing. And Alexander spent the rest of his life trying to answer it. In a way he did. His empire stretched farther than any before it. And yet, even as he ruled the world, he never found the peace that his father's simpler victories had given him. Philip fought for survival, Alexander fought for meaning, and the pursuit of meaning is a war no one ever wins. After their deaths, the world they built together fractured, but their story endured precisely because it was human. We may not march armies across continents, but we all know the feeling of living in someone else's shadow, of wanting to be seen, to be chosen, to be enough. We all inherit something, a name, a dream, a wound, and we all try in our own ways to build upon it or break free from it. That's why when you read about them now you feel less like you're studying history and more like you're eavesdropping on an eternal argument between generations. Philip's voice says, discipline, structure, patience. Alexander's answers, destiny, motion, glory. The two voices never silence each other. They harmonize in tension, creating the rhythm that drives human progress. The irony, of course, is that both of them were right. Without Philip's foundation, Alexander's dream would have collapsed. Without Alexander's dream, Philip's foundation would have faded into dust. One built the path, the other turned it into legend. And perhaps that's the real meaning of legacy, not one person surpassing another, but one life continuing another's unfinished thought. Philip began a sentence, Alexander completed it, and every time history moves forward, someone else picks up the pen. If you ever visit Macedonia today, the land feels ancient and alive all at once. The hills where Philip's armies trained still echo faintly with imagined hoofbeats. The ruins of Pella and Aegae shimmer in the sunlight, their stones half swallowed by grass, but stubbornly refusing to vanish. Tourists walk the same courtyards where father and son once argued, their voices carried away by the same wind. The air smells of time and dust, and if you stand still long enough, you might just hear it, a whisper between generations. Philip saying, "Remember where you came from." Alexander replying, "And remember why you left." That dialogue has never really ended. It plays out in every father and son, every mentor and student, every builder and dreamer who dares to change the world. Night falls slowly over the ruins of Aegae. The wind moves through the broken columns like a sigh, carrying with it the scent of old dust and olive trees. The stars begin to appear one by one, cold and bright, just as they did the night Philip was buried. The night Alexander swore his silent oath to surpass him. Time has smoothed the blood and erased the footsteps, but if you listen carefully, you can still feel their presence here. The father and the son, two voices echoing endlessly across the centuries. Philip's tomb lies deep beneath the earth, sealed in gold and shadow. The carvings on its walls still gleam faintly under the archaeologists' lights. Lions, horses, sunbursts, symbols of power, pride and lineage. Yet standing before it, you sense something gentler too. The gravity of a man who built his world from nothing, who tamed chaos with will, who dreamed not of glory, but of stability. For all his cunning and ruthlessness, Philip had been a man of order, a craftsman of destiny. His empire was not born from arrogance, but from necessity. And above him, in the night wind, the ghost of his son wanders still. Alexander's name outgrew the soil that bore him. It leapt across deserts, seas, and centuries, becoming legend long before his bones turned to dust. His tomb is lost, swallowed by history, yet his spirit lingers in every place where ambition collides with the impossible. His was the hunger that defined humanity's forward motion. But it was also the hunger that consumed him. He wanted to be remembered as more than a man. He succeeded, at the cost of never being one again. If you close your eyes here, between their worlds, Philip's earth and Alexander's sky, you begin to understand the truth of their story. Theirs was not a war of hatred, but of inheritance. The father gave his son a world to rule. The son gave that world a soul to dream. One taught the weight of reality, the other defied it. Together they built the petter that all ambition follows, first to construct, then to transcend. History, though, is cruelly selective. It remembers the fire more than the forge. The world still speaks of Alexander's conquests, but rarely of the man who gave him the tools to win them. Yet even that imbalance tells its own truth. The builder is often forgotten because he succeeded so completely that his work seems inevitable. Philip's genius disappeared precisely because it worked, but no fire burns without a hearth. Maybe that's why Alexander's story feels incomplete. Not because it ended too soon, but because it began too early. He never got the chance to live in the peace his father built. He was born in motion and died chasing it. And perhaps if he could have heard his father's voice one more time, not in command but in love, he might have finally stopped. In the end, both men became what they feared. Philip, the pragmatist, turned into myth. Alexander, the dreamer, became a monument. Neither could escape being remembered. Neither could rest. And yet there's comfort in that too. Because their story was never really about conquest or crowns. It was about the fragile, beautiful, painful truth of human legacy. About how every generation inherits both burden and gift. About how every child, no matter how mighty, still reaches for the approval of the one who came before. You can feel that same rhythm in your own life, if you listen, in the quiet between pride and doubt, in the moments when you wonder whether what you're building will last, or whether someone will one day outgrow it. That's not failure, that's continuity. That's how the world moves forward. The stars above Aegae burn softly now, their light crossing thousands of years to reach us. Somewhere in that light is Philip's patience and Alexander's fire, mingled and eternal. They are no longer rivals, no longer ghosts, just two halves of the same heartbeat, pulsing through time. So breathe with them for a moment. Let the noise of history fade. You stand between their worlds, the stone and the sky, the builder and the dreamer. The wind is cool, the night deep, the story complete. And as it settles into silence, you hear the faintest whisper, carried on the air. Build, dream, begin again. Sleep well. The world is still in motion. Good night. Sweet dreams.